No!
When people start talking about remasters for old games, one that's always going to come up in the discussion is Half-Life Source, and the reason for that isn't always positive. Back when Half-Life 2 came out and was the biggest thing in gaming since Solid Snake's taint in MGS2, there was a lot of talk about Valve remaking Half-Life in the Source engine. The technology could certainly support it and the demand was definitely there, but instead of that they did something else entirely, something much more half-assed and lazy. They took the entirety of Half-Life and just threw it into the Source engine, like ripping the toppings off of one pizza with your bare hands and then mashing it onto the top of another. The results were, well, something that's quite unique and has gone down in history as one of the worst remasters of all time. At least it's definitely a bad remaster considering the caliber of the original game itself.
Gordon doesn't need to hear all this. He's a highly trained professional.
Some of the issues this thing has are probably only things you'd notice if you're familiar with the original game, but then again there's also a multitude of problems that anyone with a working pair of eyes is going to come across. Steam describes it as a digitally remastered version using Source Engine technology to include physics simulation, enhanced effects, and more. And that is true, it does now run on the Source Engine and it now makes use of Ragdoll Physics. You've got better looking particle effects, most of which are just ripped straight from Half-Life 2. Textures and modelling though have all been left completely untouched, which in some way is kind of a good thing I guess, and at least they don't force you to play with those abhorrent so-called HD models from Blue Shift, which I still can't believe that some people think is superior to the base models.
No!
Anyway, this doesn't change the overall story or premise of Half-Life either. You're still playing as everyone's favourite silent protagonist, Gordon Freeman, killing aliens and marines as you deal with an interdimensional portal that's opened up where you work and wreaked all kinds of havoc. You can still ruin someone's microwave casserole and you can still marvel at the unfortunate name of one of the Black Mesa employees. Kuma. So that core component of Half-Life, like the virginity of a professional Fortnite player, has been kept intact. It's everything else though, where they start poking and prodding around like a chimpanzee trying to perform brain surgery using kitchen cutlery. First thing you'll notice is that like Half-Life 2, the main menu now uses dynamic backgrounds based off environments from the campaign instead of just a static image, so that's pretty cool. Right off the bat though, one of the first problems with this thing is that every chapter is unlocked, regardless of whether or not you've even finished the game in the first place. When you finally finish that mind-numbingly slow tram ride and can stretch your legs in the Black Mesa lab, you'll notice how off the sound effects are too, which is because some of them have been replaced with the sound effects from Half-Life 2. That's if they even bother to include them at all, like this bit here when you're taking this lift down after grabbing your HEV suit is supposed to play the sound effect of a lift moving, but instead now it just doesn't. Later on you'll also hear that the crowbar sound effect is all messed up too. No matter what kind of surface you're hitting, it's always going to sound like you're hitting on metal. Hit a wooden crate and it's like you're bashing a metal one. And no, it's not the sound of the crowbar itself because it never did that in the original. Music no longer carries across loading screens either, so once you've moved on to the next map, it cuts it right off, which is a bit anticlimactic. Yeah, and get used to this one because it happens throughout the entire game and it's a bit of a buzzkill. One of the first big ones you'll probably notice is during Anomalous Materials. During that classic briefing sequence before you enter the test chamber, you'll notice that this scientist in the background is just casually hovering above his chair. Later on during We've Got Hostiles, when you move down the staircase and first encounter that marine, instead of killing the scientist, now this guy does nothing. Now this doesn't seem like much, but this was such a big moment in the original game. Your natural reaction when seeing a marine is that you'd assume these guys are here to help. But then when you notice he murders the scientist, it instantly tells you that these guys are going to be hostile. Now when you take that away, all of the subtlety of Half-Life's environmental storytelling is gone, thanks to one very stupid bug.
My God, what are you doing?
Same thing a bit later on in the blast pit, the bit when that security guard runs out and gets pwned by the tentacle. Now he either doesn't run out at all, and even if he does, he can't even be killed by it. This manifests again if you get the same scene during the main menu and the guard is again invulnerable. You just get this infinite loop of these two mighty warriors locked in an eternal battle. How depressing. This was another minor detail in the original game that was just reinforcing how tough these things are, and without even saying anything, it communicated to the player that you shouldn't be running out and taking this thing head on.
Eat lead, you outer space octopus!
You might have noticed at this point too how some of the weapons feel a bit different. The main one here I think is the MP5, which now for some reason has some kind of weird sway when firing, which makes aiming a lot trickier. It's kind of like Gordon's nodding his head up and down while he's shooting. The MP5 also does way more damage, which means that when you're in combat with the Marines, you're going to get shot to ribbons a lot quicker. Probably doesn't help that they now fire their weapons more faster too. And this is where the game transcends just being a crappy remaster and starts to turn into game-changing stuff, messing with the fundamentals of the gameplay for no good reason. Here's a good example that shows both, right? Now, in questionable ethics, when you first encounter that Marine, in the vanilla game, it takes this guy so long to kill me that he just gets bored with it and even runs away. In Half-Life Source, not only is this Marine often facing the wrong way, so he doesn't even notice me, but when he detects me, he always runs around the corner, at which point you can see that he clearly mows me down in a fraction of the time. I guess the consolation here is that you dish out damage as fast as you can take it, but it is definitely a lot more different in terms of the balancing of the combat. I mean, combat that was already pretty haphazard to begin with. You'll see these minor changes all throughout the campaign too. Like this bit here in Power Up, right? These two Marines will always come running out of this doorway to attack you every single time. Whereas in the vanilla game, they always react differently. Sometimes, yeah, they come out. Sometimes they'll stay back at the door and shoot at you, or sometimes they won't even come out at all. That chopper during surface tension when you're climbing down the cliffside and first get the RPG is now completely broken. You literally can't destroy it with the amount of rockets you've been given here, compared to the original where it goes down in like 3 or 4 hits. Later on in surface tension, when you come up from those pipes and fight a few Marines, the tank in this bit can't even rotate to attack you if you get behind it, making it easy pickings. Speaking of the behaviour of enemies, another really good example is how they fucked up during Gonarch's lair. At the start of this chapter, she slowly walks into the area in what could be described as a leisurely pace, and even then she won't even really attack you at first. She'll just stand in one place and mostly fire that acid out of her ass, which doesn't even work properly either, and just leaves behind a black square as a decal. With the barnacles, their tentacles don't often reach down to the ground anymore, making it look like they're not even active, but if you walk under them, you'll get grabbed anyway, despite there being nothing there to even grab you. Now, I don't think it's all bad news. I actually think that in a lot of instances, the lighting with the Source engine actually improves some of these environments and the particle effects. They now use 3D skyboxes instead of those really low pixel static background images, so during surface tension, it looks a hell of a lot better. It's a bit of a shame though they couldn't be bothered doing this for some of the other backgrounds though, and during the ending of the game, if you can be bothered to stick it out, they'll still be using those very pixelated backgrounds. Ragdoll Physics for enemy corpses does look a lot better on the whole, but sometimes the physics can shit themselves and do something they're not supposed to. Friendly AI during those few times when you can get it is greatly improved too. You almost have to try to want to get these guys stuck now, and I'd love to see this AI upgrade applied to opposing force. The water effects also now look way better than the old engine. It looks more akin to actual water now, with rippling, refractions, and transparency, so you can even see a little bit under the surface, and it makes some of those areas look much more detailed. There's also definitely more of a contrast between the dark and the light sources, combined with more saturation, and it really makes the image a lot more vivid. Though sometimes some areas can end up looking too dark, or in some instances too bright, which is kind of weird. I think the flashlight's a lot better now too. It actually casts real-time shadows on objects in the levels, which looks great. It's actually dynamic instead of it just being a decal that lights up a small area. But then there's so many weird outright glitches and problems with some of the visuals that it almost offsets these improvements, and in some areas I think it looks worse than the original. For instance, a lot of the weapons are now super shiny, like shiny to the point as if someone spent all day rubbing these things down with Brasso or something. You can see your damn reflection in some of these, and I think the revolver is the worst of the bunch. It's the same with the specular mapping, which often contradicts the lighting of the scene itself. Like this bit here in Office Complex is supposed to be a dark and dingy hallway, and look at it with the specular mapping, it just completely fucks it all up. Probably one of the worst ones though is during residue processing. When you're making your way through the conveyor belt, it all seems fine at first, but then the skybox bursts through the map. And it's like you're staring into the devil's anus and it's assaulting on the eyes. It's almost frightening and it makes this section of the game pretty much unplayable. Later on during that bit where you move through the minefield and there's a bunch of hidden snipers, the skybox starts to spaz out too, leaving traces all over the place. Kinda reminds me of when you win a game of solitaire and the cards would fly all over the screen.
My God, what are you doing?
Now, I could go on and on about all of this stuff, and really I'm only scratching the surface. I went online and did a bit of reading around, and there's even a goddamn Wikipedia page which also lists a lot of the stuff I had issues with, along with another page that has a laundry list of stuff that they've changed. And I wasn't surprised to find that half of the things I've covered were in there. There's also another really good video series by another YouTuber named Defenestrum, going into even more detail, which I also recommend checking out. Some people have said that this is all the result of the game being carried into Valve's whole Steam Pipe upgrade, but that's horseshit. You can find threads as far back as the game's release with people all saying the same thing. It's about as broken as a middle-aged stripper with daddy issues, and it's always been the case. I guess the major consolation for a lot of these problems is that most of them aren't game-breaking, but they are game-changing. A lot of people think it's okay to ignore that because they don't make the game unplayable, but that's like driving around in a car with the check engine light on and trying to ignore it. Why not just go to the mechanic and get the engine fixed? Do you know what I mean? I think the only thing it really objectively improves doesn't really pertain to the gameplay, whereas everything that it changes or messes with does. And that's why I'd never recommend this over the original. I even made the mistake once of using Half-Life source footage in one of my videos from a few years back, and someone even called me out on it. And having now gone back and spent a bit of time with this thing, I can see why. The final nail in the coffin is that this doesn't even work with mods, so yeah, what's the point? There's been a lot of discussion lately around Half-Life, obviously with the recent release of Half-Life Alyx and also the full version of Black Mesa. And I get people asking me a lot about whether or not I'd recommend they play the original Half-Life first or Black Mesa. Now, I can understand that some people might prefer playing Black Mesa to the original. I mean, it looks a lot better, it has a heap of modern improvements and quality of life features, and I guess it's just a lot more alluring than the base game.
Bit of a gamble, but we needed the extra resolution.
Definitely feels fan-made though, which is a good or a bad thing depending on your point of view. And I'm not a fan of some of the liberties it takes with the level design and the mechanics, but if that was your first introduction to the series, well, it could have been worse. There's more than one way to skin a cat, so it's not my business which way you prefer to do it. But if you are going to play the original Half-Life, and the question is do you play the original or Half-Life Source, well, then that's a no-brainer. Half-Life Source is just a bit of an embarrassment, and the most scathing thing about it is that Valve seems to have just completely abandoned it, along with poor old Adrian Shepard, who's still hanging out in some stasis field somewhere with his dick in his hand, just wondering what the hell he can do with all this spare time.
No! Get it off me! Get it out!
As bad as the whole thing is though, it's still better than Hunt Down the Freeman.